All right, back live with you tonight on In Focus. Author and Bernstein has written an opinion piece looking deeper into the almost forgotten capture of schools and the involved corruption there. While public awareness of this issue goes back nearly a decade, but to what extent have such issues been addressed? And Bernstein joins us now for more on her piece. And good to have you. Thank you very much for coming on tonight. So the ministerial task team has been seized with this matter, I suppose, from what it looks like since 2015, 2016, even coming up with a report. What has happened to this report? Has it gone somewhere to gather dust?
Well, that's a very good question, Thabo, and good evening to you and your listeners and viewers. So 2014, the allegations were made in the media about people buying principal positions or teacher positions. The minister appointed a task team, very senior people. They reported in 2016, and their findings were shocking. They said that there was at least 38 cases that they came across with their forensic investigation that needed to be investigated further and put up for criminal prosecution. They also said that the trade union SATU is in de facto charge of the management, administration, and priorities of education in at least 6 and possibly more of the provincial departments. This is a stunning conclusion. The minister herself said in 2015, SATU had a stranglehold on the education bureaucracy. Now, we are raising this now because none of the recommendations that the task team put forward, very practical recommendations on how to deal with state capture of the bureaucracy and corruption, none of them have been dealt with. Last year, Corruption Watch, in their latest report, said that of the 3 top areas where citizens complained about corruption, education was one of those in our schools. The other day, I happened to read a story in the newspaper. The treasurer of the school governing board of a school in Soweto, he said the following. He said, the department come and loot the budget. We're calling for help from law enforcement, from the SIU. So this is a serious situation that is one of the factors that causes South Africa's schools to, in the main, deliver so poorly to their learners.
So talk to us about what work, for example, has been done, if any, around the recruitment processes, the flouting of the recruitment processes. Has any measure since 2016 been put in place, for example, to try and make that particular process as independent as possible, based on the recommendations, of course, of the ministerial task team?
To our knowledge, nothing has been done. SATU sits in on the recruitment processes, and 2 of the leading academic researchers agreed with us a few months ago in a research paper. So we're really saying that there was a lot of talk at the release of the report in 2016, but to our knowledge, nothing has been done.
So what are those key weaknesses in the appointment processes that you have picked up and that needs some tightening?
Well, at the time of the report's release, all the deputy directors general were members of SATU, regularly attending meetings. So what you have here, in terms of, if you like, the union's capture of the education system, is a confusion between who is management and who are the teachers. So we're absolutely in favor of trade unions, and teachers have every right to form trade unions. What we are saying, and the task team also said, is that the officials in the bureaucracy who manage the schools and the quality of teaching, they can't also be members of the same union. They can be members of another union, but they can't be members of the same union. So you have a confusion between management and workers, if you like, which is one of the factors that is causing a problem. The task team recommended exactly what we're saying. They said all sorts of things you would agree with that are pretty basic, that the department needed to protect whistleblowers about corruption, that SATU's official policy is one of cadre deployment into the education bureaucracy, and they've been stunningly successful. But this is not good for the quality of schooling. And you have to ask yourself, why does South Africa come last or in the bottom 3 countries of every international test our learners take? There are much poorer countries that are doing better than us. And one of the factors is we don't have accountability in our system, and who knows how appointments are made. We hear stories, and the task team certainly documented a number of cases where positions are being sold to members of unions or connected people rather than teachers and principals and other officials being appointed on merit.
And when we look, for example, and we speak of capture, I suppose when we speak of state capture, we always point to the misappropriation, maybe even of resources, and maybe some maladministration. How rife is that situation within the education sector?
Look, we don't have evidence of the misappropriation of the education resources, other than this example of the school that I mentioned in 2023. But don't forget, most of the education budget is spent on salaries. What we're saying is that the enormous influence of SATU has prevented a number of important reforms. For example, the minister we've had the same minister since 2009, and she came in with lots of good ideas. She tried to implement a special investigating unit in the department to look at what was happening in different parts of the country and the schools and to report on that. They reported once, a very important document that was sat on for quite a long time, and it talked about corruption in rural schools. Well, that unit was then sidelined. Then she introduced national assessments. Sort of every single school, every year, grades 1 to 9, were being tested on how the students were doing. The unions didn't like this. The government caved in. We don't have that anymore. The government tried to introduce performance management systems of varying kinds. Years and years of negotiation, they gave in to the union. So this is a more subtle and insidious kind of influence. And of course, you must make a distinction between actual corruption, stealing of resources, and cadre deployment. They overlap, but they are separate. And we're saying that we need to deal with corruption, and we also need to deal with cadre deployment into the education bureaucracy.
So overall, I mean, the sense that I'm getting, I suppose, from your piece is that there needs to be a reduced control or even influence of unions over the schooling education. How do we achieve that when, of course, this is a public sector space that many say requires to be unionized?
Well, as I've said, I think you need to distinguish between unionizing teachers, which I'm certainly in favor of. They have every right to do that, and unionizing management of the education system. These are different categories. So we're saying South Africa has to recognize the depth of the appalling education we provide for the vast majority of people, of learners in our schools. We have to recognize that. We have to accurately diagnose why we're in this situation. We're calling for a new team at the top of the education bureaucracy, the minister, the DG, and top officials. We're saying we need a new, fresh team committed to reform and to making the hard political decisions. Now, we're not naive. We understand that the ruling party and COSATU are in an alliance, and we're saying the president has to back the new Minister of Education in taking the hard choices that are required to move us into a different place. So we are calling for a whole lot of things that in 5 different reports that the CDE has produced, not just me.
Yeah.
And we're seriously saying this is a silent crisis which affects the lives of millions of young people, their families and their communities and the country, and that it's way past time that we took this very seriously indeed.
Interesting that you make a call to the president to actually intervene there, because if you look at SACTU, SACTU is probably one of the first unions, for example, that came up to back President Cyril Ramaphosa for a second term. We are heading to the 2024 elections. Of course, there's a lot of campaigning. One would say that's probably one of the unions that they are going to largely depend on and go to, especially if they want to see support, with some of the polls estimating the ANC going below 50%. It would be a very difficult position, I suppose, for the president to come out and say SACTU must have less influence in our education system.
Let me make 2 points. The first is that teachers need to be our partners in a reform strategy to improve our system overall. That's the first point. The second is we're not naive about the politics, and we have a very modest ambition. We're saying reforming our schooling system and getting better quality results should be one of the country's top national priorities. And we're calling on citizens, on leaders of every kind, on business leaders, the media, and everybody to say, let's make this a big issue in the general election campaign of next year. Ask political parties how they're going to get South African learners off the bottom of every international test we take. You know, in grade 4, something like 80% of our learners cannot read for meaning. Stop and think about that for a moment. So we're saying make this a big issue in the election campaign, push the political parties, ask them how they're going to improve the quality of our schooling. Will they commit to jumping up sort of above 12 countries every 3 to 5 years, as Peru has done in those international tables? Will they take seriously the sort of words the president issued that every child should be able to read for meaning by 2030? He said it, but we don't have a budget, we don't have a plan or a program to do that. So we're really calling on citizens and leaders across the board, shout about this issue. It shouldn't be a silent crisis. It's really appalling that nearly 30 years after we became a democracy, the majority of the people, the learners in our schools, are not learning to read, write, or add.
And Bernstein, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on and raising this issue so sharply with us tonight. And Bernstein, Executive Director for Center for Development and Enterprise. All right, we continue next. We look at a study that has been conducted on tailings dams.